is the exact kind of a video game that you miss out on. At least I know that I did exactly that, back when it released almost 5 years ago. My only knowledge of the game was based on its reveal trailer, back when it was still a Sony PlayStation 4 exclusive. I've seen articles online describing how awful its Nintendo Switch version was and listened to quite a few reviews calling it a shallow husk of an adventure platformer, with beautiful art design and overly quite distinct style of its aquarelle painting-like visuals. But I had never learned much about its actual contents, meaning how it played as a game. What was its story about, and what was its main theme that it wanted to represent? And let's not be afraid of using the big words here. What it was as a work of a digital art form, or most importantly in this case, to paraphrase the famous IGN meme, how did RiME make you feel as a video game? You see, RiME is the exact kind of a video game that most certainly deals with probably one of, if not the toughest part of the human experience here on Earth, having to cope with loss of those we love and care for. The game is actually structured around the well-known to the general populace so-called 5 stages of grief model, divided into denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. However, the 5 stages model, more accurately described as the Kubler-Ross model, already makes discussing this game's main theme a bit more complex, or how some people like to call it these days, quite problematic. Since from the very beginnings of the model entrenching itself in the counseling and therapist circles as well as becoming a staple of explaining the process of bereavement to the average Joe Doe through popular culture, it has been criticized for huge gaps in empirical evidence supporting the application of the 5 stages of grief model to accurately describe the emotional states of an individual currently going through loss. You see, Kubler-Ross wrote her work on death and dying, describing her research done with dying patients, so her model was focused on trying to capture the emotional states of a group of people that were personally dealing with the undeniable prospect of their own death, and not the process of grieving an already deceased loved one. There's an argument to be had about the fact grief is not universally and only tied to loss of other people, but to also, for example, ending of a relationship or very long friendship. But that discussion reaches way beyond the scope of today's topic. The popularity of Kubler-Ross's book made it so that the conversation around bereavement became deeply intertwined with this very model. All of the grief counseling techniques and tasks models in the last few decades sprung out from the fact of that book's existence. Even today, when many psychologists argue that even the more seemingly accurate dual process model of grief, describing an individual going through 2 differing orientations of loss and restoration on a constant basis, is not good enough to actually be the proper methodology of analyzing the ongoing effects of grief on a person. Moreover, the consensus around the topic seems to be that there is still much we have yet to learn about how grieving works in the grand picture of things. Seems kind of absurd when you consider how natural of a process grief is. In this situation, you could probably ask, if the Kubler-Ross model is not quote-unquote correct, why even bother with a game that structured its exploration of the topic of loss and coping on these 5 stages? I don't simply aim to be a contrarian and say that the academia is wrong about all of this. Furthermore, I usually find myself on the side of science in these sorts of conundrums. However, what I garnered from the research itself also seems to suggest that if the empirical evidence didn't exactly prove that the application of the Kubler-Ross model is viable to a person grieving a loved one, it didn't exactly disprove it either. There seems to be plenty of examples of people actually going through several stages of the model, or at least one of them, usually not exactly in a linear fashion, something that Kubler-Ross herself suggested in her work anyway. What I want to say is, as much as the theoretical background behind the structure of the game might be based on a model that has been already disproved as misunderstood simplification of what it originally aimed to describe, it does not completely take away from RiME's value as a video game attempt at trying to, without a single or at least a single understandable spoken word, explore the theme of grieving in its 5 subsequent stages. These are represented by 5 distinct and diverse in terms of the mechanics they apply levels that also thematically correspond to those 5 stages of the process of trying to cope. Every single element of this game's design ties into this theme in some way, even if it is being conveyed in a very subtle manner. And when you're taking a look at what its story is actually about, the shallow nature of the puzzles, as the reviews describe them, just points towards the conclusion that they are not the core of RiME as an experience. They were merely 2 well-telegraphed and, at points, not overly complex means to an end, trying to convey a tragic yet believable story in a subversive, almost fairy tale-like fashion. Before going any further with trying to untangle what this game tries to convey to the player throughout its runtime, I will have to make quite the self-contradictory statement first. RiME does a fairly good job of metaphorically representing the inner workings of grieving, but at the same time, it also kind of fails to understand grief. Not at the simplistic level of using a flawed theoretical model as the basis for its tale, since I'm pretty sure the interconnectedness of elements between completely separate levels suggests that the developers at Tequila Works are possibly aware of the issue that the Kubler-Ross stages model has, or at least that's what I hope they have had intended. My actual issue stems from the game's suggestion that the ways out for those who lived through these terrible life experiences, to fully understand those ways out being neither as simple nor as effective as many less qualified therapists and counselors make them out to be, are, from what I understood from the RiME's final moments, supposedly, according to the developer, quite reductively obvious, which I must hardly disagree with. The reason why is based on a personal experience. An experience which I will discuss at the very end of this video. The game begins with a violent thunderstorm, from which emerges an island. The camera pans down to reveal the supposed protagonist of this story, a young boy wearing a simple garb and a torn red piece of cloth on his back. At this point, there is really nothing else to know about the boy we are supposed to play as. Just like him, we are now stranded on this weird, ancient island with plenty of mysterious, dilapidated structures protruding between its grassy fields and hills and picturesque sandy beaches, meandering between the isle's coastal bays and caves. However, the most immediately visible part of this landscape of decay and beauty is the huge white structure, the great white tower at the very opposite end of the island that is, please forgive this pun, towering over everything beneath it. It makes it quite obvious that reaching it is your next goal. It's video game design 101. The first thing that you could notice about RiME is the fact that it's a game of very few actual mechanics. You can walk, climb, jump, interact with things, and shout. Shouting actually becomes a crucial part of solving most of the problems that you encounter from the very start of the game, making interactable elements change because of you using your voice to, for example, enable large glowing orbs filled with light to spread their area of effect magical ability to activate something that lets you through the next locked door or turns a statue of a fox into a companion for the rest of your journey. The importance of light seems to be more than just a crucial part of its puzzle mechanics, or a fancy way for the devs to show off that their engine is capable of dynamic shadows rendering or night and day cycles in a linear, non-open world game. Furthermore, it seems that light is a metaphorical representation of possibly clarity of one's mind returning to its pristine state, since it can both show you something that wasn't there beforehand, as well as literally bring things back to the world of the living when stuck in a form of cold and obviously dead stone. We mustn't also forget that in the real world, even from the very earliest beginnings of humans forming any source of civilizations, the sun almost always became a deified object, its rays dispelling the night and also bringing in the warmth, which can also be an allegory of life itself in fight against the coldness of the dark, the manifestation of death. However, the game surely does not omit to turn this notion on its head in the later stages, where light becomes actually an antagonistic force. But more on that later. As soon as you start solving the first, more expansive puzzle of the game that provides you with keys enabling you access to the Great White Tower, you notice that wherever you might go, a mysterious specter wearing a red cloak is observing you from the distance. You don't know who or what they are, but it seems following them will bring you closer to wherever it is that you might be going to whatever the source of the reason of you being in this weird world actually is. It's worth to note that the fairy tale-like aesthetics of this island, or at least the aesthetic it represents in its first level, points quite accurately towards being a representation of the denial, or more specifically, disbelief stage of grief in the Kubler-Ross model, where the person going through the process of grief denies the event even taking place at all. Denial seems like the closest thing to a status quo, where you work against yourself diving too deeply into the spiraling well of emotions that can be associated with loss, where you pretend that everything is okay. Furthermore, what could be more metaphorically accurate to that state of mind than a fantastical island of green grass, peaceful animals, and beautiful vistas? The level itself is also by far the longest you'll encounter in this game, which is quite telling. Its serene beauty makes it so that you don't exactly want to leave the place and expect to see more of it after the stage ends. However, things pan out quite differently. It's obvious that this disturbingly idyllic state of mind cannot last. After you finally reach the insides of the tower for the very first time and get to its bottom, you are met with a vision. The boy stands on a desolate, dried seabed next to a ship with a red flag right next to it, made out of the very same cloth he was wearing on his back. The boy tries to reach it, but the cloak flies away further and further until it heads into the direction of the very same storm you've seen at the beginning of the game. When the vision ends, the boy wakes up in a different version of the tower, a darker and broken down iteration of it. This time he is already greeted by the apparitions looking at him from above. He makes his way to the outside world, where he is met with possibly the most visually impressive puzzle of the whole game. A metal ball which controls the position of the sun, turning that previously mentioned day and night cycle into a gimmick you can actually try your hand at. However, when you first try to solve the puzzle, a newly introduced and completely unique to this level element emerges. A giant bird-like monster snatches the ball and flies away. Yet again, the developers clearly state your goal at the very beginning of the stage. Can you guess what it is? Yes, of course. You need to retrieve the ball back.
Fuck those things.
Unfortunately, the flying monstrosity makes that impossible. Hence, you need to make your way throughout the stage to release the storm clouds you've already seen earlier from the insides of the windmill-like structures, which certainly adds to the dream logic that the world of this game seems to follow. However, in an attempt to make it so the monster bird can snatch you away when you're not completely covered by shade, the game develops this simple yet natural and quite interesting mechanic that forces you to not allow yourself to drop your guard when out in the open. As well, it probably allows the developers to very clearly point you into the direction of the puzzle rooms they want you to visit. This quite interesting subversion of what the game was teaching you up until now, where sources of light brought you solutions to the problems you are faced with rather than being a problem themselves, points to the inherent and unshakable uncertainties that wait on the path on one's process of bereavement, especially on this particular stage of it. But what I think it also might be saying is that the nature of anger is more complicated. The monster represents the very primal response to pain and strife you feel you've been dealt by your loss. Loud and dangerous to its surroundings, maybe not exactly literally in the real world, but certainly in the world of RiME. The dark clouds you release to save yourself from that danger, however, seem to represent a deeper and more complex version of that sort of fury. Boiling underneath the surface, the self-destructive fumes of the love you still have in you towards the person you've lost. Interestingly, the dark clouds also manage to bring out the apparitions yet again, doubling down on the fact of how toxic this emotional state can be. In this case, it manages to cause even dead beings to run away in fear from you. Eventually you manage to make it impossible for the monster bird to ever fly again, in quite a gruesome manner I might add, for a game that's rated for PEGI 7. But more importantly, you head back into the tower, where when you reach the foresty entrance to yet another stage of the game, you are greeted with the continuation of your previous vision. The boy is exactly where you left him, still clinging onto the boat on the vast dried seabed. However, the wind rises and makes him fall off back onto the deck, turning the surroundings into equally as vast and furious sea. Then you spot the mysterious cloaked figure standing on the deck in front of the boy. The picture seems clear now, but there are still some aspects that you need to understand further to put all of the pieces of this narrative puzzle together. After leaving anger behind, now comes the middle part of the Kubler-Ross model, bargaining. And even from the very first seconds of the level, you realize how cleverly the devs approached designing the level to subconsciously represent that particular theoretical stage of bereavement. The looping rooms of the first initial area clearly point to a person being torn between the realizations they started to make at the anger stage and wanting to come back to the safety of denial. Eventually, you do make it through these rooms, and then end up finding out what the gimmick of this part of the game is going to be. The giant walking metal ball thingies, apparently called sentinels, that boost your ability to use your voice to activate the balls of light, which becomes quite useful in the puzzles you encounter ahead. As well as it becomes a useful way to deal with apparitions who become aggressive in this part of the game. Similarly to the inner thought processes of a person being at the bargaining stage, they don't want you to make any progress whatsoever. As you can see, the theme of light versus dark is yet again quite strong in this stage of the game as well, this time being the fuel that brings your mechanical friends back to life. However gamey all of this wouldn't sound to your ears, it seems that this level delves into the theme of thought experiments one might become obsessed with in the bargaining stage in a way that does resemble some of the methods people stuck in it reach for. Some plead to a deity to give their loved ones back to them. Some go right back into denial for a time, and others try to find reasons not to push on. And in the case of the protagonist of RiME, it seems assembling an army of friendly robots, or whatever they are, is his goal now. But as seen with previous levels, we eventually need to make it to the next stage. So you make your way back to the current version of the tower and head towards the inevitable stage of depression. You're yet again met with a vision from before. The boy tries to reach the cloaked individual, but it's too late. The mysterious character falls over the railing of the deck and the boy makes a last-ditch effort to try and save him, but he fails. The individual disappears beneath the waves, and the boy is left there stranded with a piece of cloth torn from the man's cloak. So is the true meaning behind the plot revealed here? Not exactly, but you'll get your answers soon enough. Riding on the back of one of the sentinels, the boy wakes up in the darkest version of the island yet. A dark, flooded place of ruin and despair, with rain mercilessly showering from above, carving its way into crumbling rock. It's clear that this stage is meant to start to blur the lines between what actually is happening in this story versus the metaphorical representations we have been playing throughout. The boy traverses through the ruined landscape with his sentinel buddies towards sets of doors which can only open if a sentinel enters them and becomes a sort of a living key, sacrificing himself in the process. The boy realizes all of this too late when the last sentinel, the first sentinel he bonded with, is set to become a key as well. He tries to stop him, but he's not able to. Just as in the real world, the looming vision of acceptance on the horizon pushes the boy into the deepest depths of despair. The main puzzle of the stage revolves around activating statues similarly to what you did back in the Nile. But with each one of them, and with each sad howl of the fox whenever you manage to get to one of these, you start to prepare for a grim conclusion. No video game level named simply as Depression can be anything else, really. It might seem like this part of the game itself is quite short when in comparison with other stages, only introducing a very simple lever mechanic that destroys some of the structures in the area, enabling you to access the statues you need to activate, but I wouldn't read it as some sort of a time constraint limiting the devs from making the level more elaborate. It seems more like a conscious choice to interconnect this stage to the final one in a more complex and less defined manner than other levels. After you activate all of the statues in the level, you're met with yet another loss. The little fox dies in the arms of the boy, causing him to shout out in pain, which turns him to the same stone statues you've seen across the island before. It's here where the game suggests that the boy finally gives in to the feeling of utter despair brewing inside of him. The visions and the loss of all of his friends he met on his journey break him down completely, and so he emerges from the stone, looking very much the same as the apparitions he met throughout his journey. But he does not stop. He makes his way into the tower one last time, solves the final light puzzle while turning into a bright version of the apparition from before, signifying, just as in the puzzles from the very first level, that he has finally reached some sort of clarity. He then descends deeper into the tower, finding the corridor leading to the acceptance chapter to be upside down. Just how the truth of what is actually going on in this story is destined to flip everything on its head. It is here when the final plot twist of the game is revealed. The vision we see this time is a representation of the actual version of the events. This time we play as a bearded man on the very same boat from before, stranded in a storm. He makes his way towards the boy, our protagonist wearing the cloak we've seen the mysterious shadowy character wear earlier. The boy falls over the deck, barely holding onto it. The man, his father actually, tries to reach him. The boy falls down into the water, and the father is left only with the torn red piece of cloth ripped off from the boy's cloak. The camera zooms into the great white tower looming over the whole scene. And then the boy wakes up in the afterlife version of his real-life family home. He makes his way towards his father's figure sitting at the end of the corridor, and then the vision withers away, the boy now standing in front of what we can only assume is the final step in leaving depression behind, the metaphorical well of souls. And of course, like in any other video game, the only choice is to jump into it. we have reached the very final stage of the game, now playing as the father of the boy back in the real world of RiME. We make our way towards the room at the end of the corridor, finding out within that it belonged to his son. The items placed in this room call back to the levels we have played through before, and if you're very diligent about finding them, you can also find the toys and other collectible items you managed to gather on your journey. The father prepares to leave the room, but then sees an apparition of his son sitting on the bed, and as he probably wants to hug him for the very last time in his life, the apparition withers away, only leaving him with the red cloak in his hand. If you finally click the interaction button, the camera moves out of his home and all you are met with is the vista of a boat in the bay and a tower, a lighthouse. The last thing the boy probably has ever seen in his life, the centerpiece of the entire game's structure. The final interaction of the game is to simply let go. Plot twist endings like this have the inherent tendency of completely reframing the stories they conclude. It's no different in the case of RiME. You might be fooled into thinking that you're living through a fantasy of a grieving child. However, what you're actually witnessing is his father trying to assemble himself back together after losing his only child, telling himself a tale of the boy exploring idyllic and mysterious worlds, meeting his toys now being turned into real, living beings, having adventures most could only dream of. Since this is a tale of working through one's grief, the tale gets twisted more and more as it continues, embracing more and more of the elements of the day when the boy was killed in that storm, sprinkling them in throughout particular moments of your playthrough. To some, this might cheapen the experience to a degree, falling into the narrative trope of it was just a dream, but to me personally it gave this simple and colorful indie game a layer of meaning that I have not expected to get from such a title. Truly managed to convey elements of the Kubler-Ross model theory in a video game format in a way that most AAA games can only dream of. However, we need to come back to the question that you've seen in the title of this video. Paraphrasing it a bit, since I suppose I already changed it due to the reality of how these sorts of videos spread around YouTube and how SEO works in terms of these things. Does RiME, a video game, actually understand grief? The simple answer is no. Well, maybe let me phrase this a bit more precisely now. The structure of its levels is absolutely on point, and the way it tells its story accordingly to how a person should process their grief in a perfect, probably non-existent reality where we are all the same person is actually done by the book. The recontextualization that the ending brings causes small details like the keyholes with fresks depicting a fairy tale about a king of some unknown kingdom, or the fragmented appearances of a mysterious weird-looking apparition that is revealed to be a representation of a wife that the man also lost. It all plays into the grand picture of the story that the game weaves in a touching and deeply emotional way. It seems to me that the game acknowledges the fact that the theory behind its structure is not perfect or exactly linear. However, what ruins whatever the devs wanted to achieve here is the final moment of the game. The unsubtle way of representing the hardest part of a grieving process, as simply letting a loved one fade away, makes the game end on a bit of a harsh, maybe even false note. The simple notion of being able to just forget or move on is both against what modern psychology tells us and what a person that lost the people they love actually feels. Mind you, I have no actual solution here. I don't know how the ending of this game could have been improved on, when based on a model that expects a person to be able to find a perfect cutoff point for their bereavement. Maybe the game should just fade away, maybe the father should just keep the cloth, maybe it should be a choice made by the player. Or maybe I am completely wrong about this, and this story talks about a person that is still locked in the cycles of living through their grief over and over again. If you would give the dev team the benefit of the doubt that that was their actual intention behind giving you access to chapter select after you finish the game, it surely seems possible when you take a quick gander at the very first cutscene of the game. However, I just don't know. RiME seems surely like a weird choice for a game to come back to making these videos with. Believe me, I'm very well aware of that fact. However, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, there was a personal reason behind me going through this whole project. Earlier this year, I lost my best friend. It wasn't any sort of a disease nor anything violent or did not involve a third party really. Just a case of something bad happening to a regular human being just like it does every other day of the week. That event caused me to reevaluate a lot of things in my life. There was a short moment when I considered abandoning this channel because of it, but here we are. I'm still here. It's just that I'm a little more alone than the last time I've talked to you people. Now that I think of what I've said at the beginning of this video, I think RiME is an exact kind of a video game that you miss out on because it only tries to find you when you need it most.